This is the regional program. I Was There, talks by men who saw the making of history. Nowadays, a passenger to America has no misgivings, but nearly a generation ago, a terrible catastrophe in mid-ocean had to mark the end of an era of peril in Atlantic transport. On the 15th of April, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg, and in a couple of hours, a great liner had sunk on her maiden voyage at a cost in human life of 1,500 souls. Commander Lightoller was second officer, and when he had seen the last of the insufficient lifeboats pull away from the ship, he plunged into the sea and was ultimately rescued. All the other officers who went down with the ship were drowned. Commander Lightoller.
Altogether, I've had 4 shipwrecks and a fire during my 30-odd years at sea. But by far and away the worst of them all was the one I'm going to tell you about now, the loss of the Titanic. I joined her in Belfast while she was still in the builder's hands, the biggest and finest ship in the world. And given the normal life of a ship, I'm pretty sure she would have proved the fastest. But let me say right here and now, neither that night nor that voyage were we out for any records. We ran our trials in Belfast Lough and then took her round to Southampton. On April the 10th, that's 1912, she sailed on her maiden and only voyage for New York. From the moment we left Belfast, we had marvelous weather. And even when we got out on the Western Ocean, or Atlantic, as you probably know it, it was as smooth as the proverbial mill pond, not a breath of wind, and the sea like a sheet of glass. In any other circumstances, those conditions would have been ideal. But anyone with experience of ice at sea knows that those very conditions, and the moonless night, only render the detection of icebergs all the more difficult, and calls for additional alertness on the part of both officers and men. Speaking for myself, I knew only too well that there were chances, if long ones, of sighting an iceberg, but as I reckoned, in ample time to clear it with a turn of the wheel.
But I joined the Olympic in 1911 on a maiden voyage, and after 5 voyages we were in collision with the Hawk and the Solent, so we put back again. Well, I did about 5 voyages, and I was transferred, selected I might say, to be conceded, selected to go to the Titanic. So they're picking out the best of the crew, pat my back on it, best of the crew to go to the Titanic.
I'd never seen a big ship before, and I didn't realise how big it was. It looked very big, but then I had nothing to compare it with. Everybody was very excited, and we went down to the cabin, and that's when my mother said to my father that she had made up her mind quite firmly that she would not go to bed in that ship. She would sit up at night, and I remember my father saying to her, "Well, if you want to be so stupid, I can't stop you, but I don't know what you think people will say." And she said, "I don't mind what they say. That's what I'm going to do." And there was no further argument about it. She decided that she wouldn't go to bed at night, and she didn't.
Where I work, we had a man boss, and which was Mr. Temple, and he died of cancer. And Mr. Saw told us that they'd done all the uniform for the Titanic, and he said they had to hurry to do it, and he said to one of the men, "I hope I should never see this again," because he thought they'd all bring it back, you know. And he said it was only the matter of speech because the work was so bad where they had to do it so quickly. And he said, "Little did I think that the Titanic was going down," and he didn't see it again. He said he always thought of that.
My mother would never go and see my father off, and this particular day she went, and she always swore that that was the most unlucky thing that she ever did.
When I was on board on deck, the 2 or 3 days out, I met a woman with a daughter about the same age as me, and we used to talk to each other. But when the accident happened, I don't know, I never saw them. So she was just the only child with mother and father. But she was a very nervous woman. She's never been on a ship before. And she was so frightened. Always used to say, "I am so nervous. I've never been on a ship before." And she must have died in her sleep, you know.
RMS Titanic, Wednesday, 10th of April, 1912. Dear Louisa, the Titanic is the biggest ship in the world. There's a swimming bath, a gymnasium and Turkish baths in it. The ship started at about 12:15. Then we had a long delay because the ship broke into the ropes of another ship, the Oceanic, and it went floating about and knocked into this ship. But they got it all right after a bit. This is the first long voyage a Titanic has ever made. It is quite calm. Yesterday we went in a boat on the river. Dennis and I rowed a lot. Yesterday morning we motored to the sea. Last Monday Dennis went out fishing with the little boy. Dennis did not catch anything, but he found an eel, which we had for breakfast the next day. It is quite calm now. Nobody has been sick so far. We should arrive at Cherbourg at 5, but I do not think we will get there till 6. Please write soon to me. Love from Eileen.
Everybody kept saying, she's unsinkable, she won't go down. She's unsinkable.
Were your parents also in bed asleep?
Well, my father never said anything. But he was smoking a cigar, and we just, as I told you, he went up on deck to see what the trouble was. Then he came back and told us to get dressed and come up on deck. And of course, we stayed there. We must have been there for over an hour before anything came. Nobody worried about it. Some of the people from the third class must have come up, played with the ice on deck. A lot of them, and people in the first class, they wouldn't believe it. They said, no, she's unsinkable. They went back to bed.
She felt this little bump, as she always described it, because we were a very long way from it. We were on the port side of the ship and collision was on the starboard side of the ship. And had she been asleep, it wouldn't have wakened her. It didn't waken anybody else in the cabins round about there at all, but she was wide awake. And she felt this bump and she immediately wakened my father. And he wasn't very pleased about this because she'd wakened him the night before and made him go up on deck because she heard something that she thought was untoward. And that was ice floes in the sea bumping against the side of the ship. So when she called him on the Sunday night, he wasn't very pleased about that.
On that night of April the 14th, we all, that is, the captain and officers, knew perfectly well that we were just about entering the region where ice might be sighted at that particular time of the year, and had taken all necessary precautions. Now, throughout the day, there had been the usual wireless messages from different ships reporting the weather, odd icebergs, and so forth. But as none of these bergs reported lay on our course, well, they didn't directly concern us. But when the evidence came to be sifted out at the inquiry held in London afterwards, it then came out that one very vital message received in the Titanic's wireless room that night had never been delivered to the bridge. That message came from a ship called the Masaba, warning all ships of heavy pack ice, icebergs, and field ice in an area then lying right ahead of the Titanic, and what was still worse, not far away. Those immense quantities of ice were abnormal for almost any time of the year, and the significance we should have attached to that report can hardly be exaggerated. In my opinion, it was a warning of the most vital importance. You see, I was officer of the watch and in charge of the ship when that Masaba message came over, and I know perfectly well what I should have done if it had come to my hands. Without a shadow of doubt, I should have slowed her down at once. That would have been imperative, and sent for the captain. More than likely, in fact almost certainly, he would have stopped the ship altogether and waited for daylight to feel his way through. Anyhow, the long and short of it is, neither he nor I nor any other officer of the ship got that message. Now to go on. We were steaming that night at a good 22 knots. At 10 o'clock, I was relieved as officer of the watch by Murdoch, W.M. Murdoch. He and I had been shipmates in many of the ocean greyhounds. And both of us had crossed this ice region times without number, both in clear weather and what's more in fog. After the usual formalities, I handed over, wished him joy of a few perishing cold hours, and went below. I expect his watch went on as mine had done. Nothing to see and nothing to hear except the distant roar of the water at her bows, that and the half-hourly bells with a lookoutman's cry of all's well. Of course, he knew nothing of the death trap lying ahead of us any more than I did. And so 5 bells, 6 bells, and 7 bells went by. But barely 10 minutes had passed after the sound of the last bell when there were 3 sharp clangs on the crow's nest bell, followed by a cry from the lookout cage, "Ice right ahead, sir." Murdoch evidently saw the massive ice practically at the same time as the lookout men and shouted, "Hard a starboard, full speed astern." His idea was to swing her bow clear and then put the helm hard over the other way and so swing her stern clear. And given half a chance, I believe he'd have done it. But going at that speed, it was too late. As it was, her bow swung a bit, but not enough, and she struck. She took the blow along her starboard side, masses of ice actually falling on the foredeck. But what was worse, though we didn't know that till he came out of the inquiry, she was pierced below the waterline in no less than 6 compartments, and from that moment, nothing could have saved her.
And then she wakened me, and she didn't say why, but she said, "I'm going to dress you." And I said, "Oh, no, you're not." And got back into bed. By that time, my father, who'd been up to the boat deck in a lift, which was quite close by our cabin, he'd been up there, and he came back. And all he said to her was, "You had better put this thick coat on that I've got on." And she stood up, and he put his coat on her. I used to say to her many years afterwards, when he came back, "You didn't say to him, 'What was it?'" She said, "I didn't have to. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't have to ask. I knew this something that's been over my head for months, and here it was, like a great black cloud." Anyway, my father put another coat on, and he picked me up, wrapped a blanket round me, and we went up onto the boat deck, and got there, of course, quite quickly. Well, as you know, and as everyone knows, the tragedy of the Titanic was the fact that she hadn't got enough lifeboats. So it was only the people who were there first that got into a lifeboat, and we were there in plenty of time. The boats weren't even being lowered when we got up onto the deck. And my father went away and spoke to one of the sailors who came, and he came back and said, "Oh, we've hit an iceberg." Again, my mother didn't say, "Oh, have we?" or "Where is it?" She just said nothing. And he went away again, and he came back and said, "Oh, I've spoken to one of the officers. They're going to launch the lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast." And so, thinking that this was what was going to happen, they started to lower the boats, and my father put my mother and I without any trouble at all. As I say, if we'd still been out in the cabin asleep, we would have got on deck too late. So it is only because my mother had that premonition that I'm able to talk to you today. There's no doubt about that. He made no attempt to get in himself. He helped other women and children, and that was it. I never saw him again.
I was lying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar, not any sense of collision, but more a kind of shiver that ran through the ship. Anyway, it was enough to bring me out of my bunk in one jump. Out on deck, I ran over one side and then to the other, but there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck. So back I went to my bunk and just waited. If I was wanted, naturally my cabin would be the first place where anyone sent for me would look. You see, apart from being nearly frozen, even an officer, when off watch, isn't exactly welcomed on the bridge, either in pajamas or anything else. Anyway, it wasn't long before Boxall, the 4th officer, poked his head round my door and said, "Do you know we've struck an iceberg?" "I know you've struck something," I told him, not thinking it anything serious and feeling none too pleased. Then he said, "The water's up to F deck in the mailroom." There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater and bridge coat and out on deck almost as soon as he was.
It was a clear night. There was no signs of any fog. The set of stars was handed over to me that Lightoller had taken in the second dog watch. When I got these stars, I said, now Moody, you go around the decks and come back at 9 o'clock. I don't know whether the captain came up before 9 o'clock or after 9 o'clock, but anyway, I didn't leave the bridge until after 10 o'clock, having worked the stars out, and when the captain came up, I showed him the position on the chart. She was just over 20 miles ahead of the dead reckoning. And at 10 o'clock, I told Moody to take over the bridge, and I reported to the first officer that I was going round the decks. It was a customary thing. At the time when the iceberg was reported from the crow's nest, when they struck the bells, I was sitting in my cabin having a cup of tea, and immediately got up and walked along to the bridge, about 60 feet away on the same deck. I was about halfway between the officers' quarters and the bridge when the crash came, and it didn't break my step. She was doing full speed, and it didn't break my step. And I got to the bridge, and the captain had evidently arrived about the same moment, and I heard him say to Murdoch, what's the matter, what have you stuck? He said, we've stuck an iceberg, sir. He said, I'm going full speed astern, sir, on the port engine. He swung her head round towards port, and she was on the swing.
Now we've been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve. And as a result, the steam roared off at all exhausts. The row was absolutely deafening. Added to that, the engineers started to blow the boilers down. Shout as loud as you liked. No one could hear a word. At the same time that Boxall had called me, the order had been given, all hands on deck. And I met my watch tumbling up on the boat deck just as I got there. And the boat deck, just in case you don't know, is the top deck of all. I got hold of the bosun's mate and sort of showed him with my hands that I wanted him to start the men stripping off the boat covers. Now, in the merchant service, men are taught to think and, if necessary, act for themselves. They don't wait for pipes or bugles, and I can tell you the 700-odd survivors of that night can thank God they don't. Every man jack just went about his job well as if it were an everyday occurrence. When the boats were stripped and cleared, they were swung out and lowered to the level of the boat deck. Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat.
Well, whilst Captain was talking to Murdoch at the starboard wing of the bridge, I slipped down to go forward and have a look to see if I could find any damage. Nobody told me to go. You had to go down about 4 bridge ladders, you see. And I went forward to these third-class passengers with Southern European people were streaming up on deck, and I went down, I think it was 2 decks down, as low as I could go without removing any hatches or anything. I went down to the third class, crossed over to the starboard side, and I walked along there and looked in the cross passages. I couldn't hear any noise. I couldn't see any damage. And I eventually came up on deck again. As I was emerging on the deck, some of these men were on their way back again to their beds. And there was one man had a piece of ice, and I took it away out of his hands, wondering where he got it from. And I spoke to him in English and tried to make him understand that it was nothing, there was nothing the matter. Go down and go to bed and go to sleep again, you see. And I took this piece of ice and walked along the upper deck on the starboard side to see where the ice came from. And there, just inside of the ship's rail, there was a powdering of ice running along as though she'd compressed it. There was no wind, you see, and it would fall inboard. I came up onto the bridge again and reported to the captain, I've been down below, sir, right down as far as I could go without removing hatches or tarpaulin, right through a third-class accommodation forward. And I don't see any signs of any damage, not even a glass port broken. He said, did you see the carpenter anywhere, Mr. Boxall? I said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I do wish you'd go down and find him and tell him to sound the ship round for him and let me know right away. Well, I didn't get down all the ladders down to the foredeck. I met the carpenter coming up, absolutely out of breath, and he said, Mr. Boxall, he said, the forepeak hatch is blown off and number 1 tarpaulin is ballooning up. He said, she's evidently making water fast. The captain is on the starboard wing of the bridge, and tell the captain. I didn't get down to the foredeck because I met a mail clerk coming up. And he said, Mr. Boxall, the mail room's filling. So I said, oh, carry on, and you'll find the captain on the starboard wing of the bridge and report to him. I said, I'll go down there and have a look. So I continued on my way down to the mail room. I tried to go into the first-class entrance from that lower deck, from the foredeck. But they'd got the watertight door closed, and I had to come up all these ladders and go up over the promenade deck and then down through the main saloon entrance, where I found the band was tuned up. And I got my way down to the mail room, and I got down as far as the sorting room. And all the mail clerks were there pulling letters out of the racks. And I was standing on the top of a companionway from the sorting room down to the handing room. And I saw a bag floating by. I instinctively stooped down to try and pick it up. I just couldn't reach it. I realized then that it was serious.
My grandfather must have worked in the engine room too, because he, when they hit the Titanic, Dad was asleep in his bunk, and my grandfather threw a lump of ice on his bunk and said, "Wake up, Wally, we've hit an iceberg." He went down in the engine room and they never saw him again.
Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them? I told them it was merely a precaution, and that very likely they'd all be taken on board again at daylight, or at the worst, taken on board the ship everyone could clearly see, only a few miles away. We could see all her lights, quite plainly. But here again we were up against it. That ship was the Californian, and though her lights were plain to everyone on board the Titanic, she seemed to pay not the slightest heed either to our wireless calls or to the distress signals we were firing every minute. The reason why she didn't answer our wireless calls, which other ships heard halfway around the earth, was because she only carried one wireless operator. And when we struck the iceberg, he'd just gone off watch, so it was no fault of his.
We went through this narrow ice field there to the Mount Temple, thinking she might pick off the. Found she wasn't. We saw this other ship on the port, back on the same side we'd been on, and we steamed back through the ice. That's when Ross was all coming along.
But why no notice was taken of our distress signals, shells that are fired hundreds of feet up into the air to explode with a cascade of stars, heaven only knows. What a chance her captain missed. He could have laid his ship right alongside the Titanic and taken practically every soul on board. However, he didn't, and the two ships gradually drifted further and further apart. And, according to the officer of the watch of the Californian, the Titanic's lights disappeared at 2:40 a.m. They did, and with his own eyes, he'd personally witnessed one of the greatest tragedies of the sea.
The officer came along and said, women and children first. So my father came up and he says he put my mother and I into a lifeboat. He was smoking a cigar and then he walked away. They wouldn't believe that the boat was sinking.
Up to the time of getting away the first few boats, no one believed that the ship was actually in any danger. I'm afraid my own confidence that she wouldn't or couldn't sink rather conveyed itself to others. For there were actually cases where women absolutely refused to be put in a boat. I remember one young couple, evidently not long married, walking up and down the boat deck. I asked the girl, she was only a girl, from the western states I should say, if I should put her in a boat. But no, she wouldn't be parted from her husband. Not on your life, she said. We've started together and we'll finish together. Brave girl, but she didn't know how near that finish was. Certainly I didn't. As time went on, I could see the bows of the ship getting steadily lower and lower in the water. Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down a long stairway that led from the boat deck 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never likely to forget the sight of that cold, greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway. Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and others, already submerged, were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency.
Well, we sat there about 20 hours, right through the night. Nothing to do, just living in hopes. Well, someone started to curse and swear farther down on the ship, and someone said, this is no time for swearing, it's time to say your prayers, which we did.
As you know, the Carpathia picked us up the next morning, and everybody was very, very kind to us on board the ship. And people looking round to see if the people they'd left behind had by any chance been picked up by another boat or something, but no one ever found.
After we were picked up on the Carpathia, my mother came to me, because every time a lifeboat came, I went to see if my father was on it, see? And he wasn't. So my mother turned around and said, he says, you've lost your father. And you won't see your father anymore.
Anyway, we sat there through the night, and as they come towards the dawn, more or less, the lights where the ships came in sight, saying, there's a ship. I said, there's 2. It turned out that one was the ship and the other was the iceberg, laying alongside of each other. It was the Carpathia that came up to take us off.
At full daylight, there was the Carpathia steaming toward us. I needn't say just what sort of a welcome sight it was either. Cruising slowly round, she collected the boats one by one. Mine, I know, was loaded down to the gunwales, and no easy job to keep afloat in the rising sea. At last, everyone was safely on board, and with the 700-odd survivors of that night, she turned away from that tragic spot and headed for New York.
People were running around the street. The Titanic sunk. And it was panic. There's panic stations everywhere, women running out and going down to the shipping office, down near the dock gates there. And they can't sink the Titanic, because we'd had it, didn't we? Everybody talked about the Titanic. It was the unsinkable ship. She had double-bottom tanks and all this sort of thing, and watertight doors. It was impossible for her to sink. There wasn't a family in the whole of that area that never had anybody associated with that ship. Fathers and sons and uncles and grandsons and all this sort of thing, to be on a great Titanic, you see. And, they were all shipping community, a shipping and dock working community. And as I say, everybody run down there. Of course, it was real panic. I can see it now, as I can visualize them. The women running out, in their aprons or whatever, busy doing their household chores, and forget everything and all run down
to the shipping office, and that was the only place you could get any news, you see.
I remember very well my mother saying how on the morning of the disaster, she was spring cleaning in our front bedroom and heard a commotion. So she went downstairs to see what it was, and it was echo boys running round the streets, shouting out, "Disaster at sea, Titanic sunk," and there was a special edition of the Echo. My father worked in the docks. He was in charge of the pay office of the Mechanical Engineers Department of the Southern Railway, and he said on several occasions how not only the town was in complete mourning over the disaster, but in the docks every single man wore a black armband for some days afterwards.
Yes, and we used to go down the dock gate with a friend, big friend in Askew Park Street. Her father was on there, and her father got lost, but we used to go and they put the names up in outside the dock gate to, who was rescued and that. Yeah, I remember ever so plain. This girl at school, she used to come and say, coming down the dock gate, me and my sister used to go down the dock gate to see if her father's name was up there.
Things weren't so noisy in those days as they are now, but the town went absolutely quiet. A great hush descended on the town because I don't think that there was hardly a single street in Southampton who hadn't lost somebody on that ship. And it was, as you know, supposed to be unsinkable, and it was a very great shock. I remember in those days there wasn't much in the way of assistance for widows and orphans, and I can quite clearly remember going to a concert probably a bit later in the same year that was sunk, which was in aid of the widows and orphans. The admission was twopence, and I can distinctly remember the turns that went on those days, because in those days these little concerts for charities and one thing and another were quite a feature of life, and that is where we got our entertainment from.
And those feet have a proven time. Could you all win without pain or shame? Over the danger would be hard.
We had a lady visitor from the Titanic Disaster Fund. She used to come about once a month, see if I was being treated right. I was just 5 months old. Because I don't believe Father ever slept in the house. He was down on the, down working on the boat and possibly slept on there. I think he just popped in it just 2 or 3 times. He just about managed to get us moved down there, and that was it. I don't know what she had from her pension, but when she remarried, and she still drew a pension from me, and I believe it's 30 shillings a month. She used to draw that at the London and Provincial Bank, which was on the corner by Holy Rood.
She had a pension from the Titanic Fund once a month. When I was a young girl at school in the infants, I went to school with a boy across the road, and he had ringworm, and I caught it, and I was off school for 6 months. And I had to have my hair all cut off, and the Titanic people paid for me to go to a convalescent home at Worthing for a month because they thought I needed to get over it. And also when I was 14 they paid for me to go to a commercial school to learn shorthand and typewriting, English. And
a lady by the name of Miss Newman, who used to come from the Hawthorne cottage in the centre of the common. And she used to ride her upright bicycle, also with her Dalmatian dog, always in the front, walking or running beside her. And she used to come regularly, once or twice a month. I think it was to see my brother, who was, a Titanic orphan, how he was getting on.
Every year when the date of the Titanic came, he used to pop off on his bike, and my mother used to say to me, "You know where he's gone, don't you?" And he always went to the Titanic. He never said anything, just used to go to Titanic memorials, and I suppose to pay his respects and to remember. People used to say, "Oh, you know, your dad was on the Titanic," and it was quite a thing, really. And we always said, "Oh, Dad was on the Titanic," you know. But it was just one thing I suppose we grew up with.
There were so many other orphans round about my age whose fathers had been killed in the war. When we were growing up, there weren't a lot of young married men about. There were very few. They were elderly men and women, obviously women, but as far as young men were concerned, very, very few. If there were, they probably had something wrong with them, which probably consumption or something like that, because there was a lot of that about. He's 23. And, 23? Yes, 23. And, no, it didn't affect, not me, you know, not with other kiddies or anything. There was no sympathy and no jeering. I mean, it was, well, just natural for quite a lot of people not to have a father.
Well, we were emigrating to Kansas. My father had a public house in London and was told by his relations in Kansas there was more opportunity there, so he decided to emigrate to Kansas. And we weren't supposed to go on the Titanic, we were going on another ship. But because there was a coal strike at the time, and all the coal was needed for the maiden voyage of the Titanic, they asked him if he'd like to go on the Titanic. And I was 8 years old. And then she was going to get married again, so thought that she'd better tell me about it. So all she said was, the night it happened, we were all in the cabin, and my mother and father, they heard a crash. And my father said he'd go up on deck to see what had happened. He went up on deck and said apparently the ship had struck an iceberg. Get the children out of bed and up on deck as quickly as possible. That's what my mother did. They never stopped to think the ship was unsinkable, as some did. And we got up on deck, I think with the help of a sailor. And my mother was saying goodbye to my father, and he said, "Hope to see you later." And got into lifeboat number 13. Because I was small, I was put in a sack and put over the side in lifeboat number 13. And my mother didn't realise that my small brother was there as well. She didn't realise that he wasn't with us until they were rescued by the Carpathia.
Well, we're going now to the Midlands to find out how this important film of the Titanic was discovered after all these years.
We were talking about old films, that was his life. I said, "Sure, got that Titanic film." She said, "Might come in handy someday."
Renee Mason found the lost film of the Titanic in her garden shed. Renee's husband, Archie, started as a trainee projectionist in 1913.
Oh, he started when he was 13, and he's shown films all his life until he was over 80, and that's how I met him, because I worked, he showed films at one cinema, and I played the violin for the silent pictures in the other. That's how we met. His cinema's in one street and my cinema's in with another, and that's how we met. And I heard about the film they're making in America, Titanic. Oh, wonder where that whole film is. So I said to my son David, have a look in the shed. I said Dad kept all his old stuff in the shed. You know, he searched and searched. No, he said he must have got rid of it. I didn't think he would. He liked it too much, and I thought myself I could have another look. I couldn't find it. That was on a Saturday. I went to bed, woke up in the night, well, half asleep and half awake, and I heard this voice saying, "It's in the shed. It's in the shed under the bench." Oh, I thought myself, that's funny. I woke up, I got up ever so early in the morning, Sunday morning, thought myself I'd better go and have a look under the bench in the shed. So I got on my hands and knees, all in the dust and that. I had just room for my hand to get an arm to get under on the floor. And I started one end and it was have nothing, and I reached right up the very end, up the corner. I felt something and dragged it out, and it was a film tin. Of course I didn't know if it was a Titanic film or not. Oh, I brought it out here, I got a knife, and ever so rusty, and I ate it all the way around with a knife, so it took me a long while to get it open, but I gradually got it open, and there was a film inside.
You reported an iceberg in a latitude 5 miles to the south of where you were. 3 icebergs.
Yes.
You reported 3 icebergs,
Yes.
which were also reported by the Parisians in approximately the same position. So you must have been up to the northern of those 3 icebergs.
We were.
Now, if you plot the position of the icebergs and the reported position of the Titanic sinking, which was accepted by the inquiry, but which you dispute. But if you take the reported position, that is where the Mount Temple eventually found itself, and you take another position 5 miles to the north, which is where Lord Mersey said you were, or 10 miles to the north, which is where his assessors said he was, to get to those, either of those 2 positions, the 5 miles or the 10 miles, your ship, from passing the icebergs at 5:30, must have steered a course either 10 degrees to port or 20 degrees to port. Did you ever
Never.
stayed in the ship where those alterations of course were?
Oh, it's ridiculous. There's no question about it. Everything was going along and spick and span. The logbook was filled up correctly, and I laid the course, and she made the course.
North 61 West magnetic.
Was that it?
Now, Stuart left the bridge at 8, and he would hand over the course
to the third officer,
who would normally check it both on the slate and with the quartermaster.
We had, in my recollection, we had a blackboard there with a chalk course written on it for the man looking right at it couldn't make any mistake.
You were on the bridge from 8 till the ship started.
20 past 8.
So Groves would be keeping a somewhat keener interest in things.
You would think so. He was on one of the left wing, fourth wing of the bridge, and I was on the starboard wing, a little inside the extreme wing, standing by the telegraph.
So the ship must have steered either north 51 west, or north 71 west, or north 81 west, to have made either of these 2 positions which Lord Mersey.
Oh, it was perfectly ridiculous. No such thing ever happened in any ship. The course is laid, and the officer on the bridge see that it's steered, and the man at the wheel gets it from the man before him, and the 2 courses are checked by the 2 officers, and no question of that. The officer even gives the course to the man who's relieved him, and he checks it at once while looking at the compass.
So to get to these 2 positions, then you must somehow or other have been pushed to the southern. And as you say, it's in the highest degree unlikely that the chief officer, the third officer, and you yourself could have failed to detect a deviation of course of 10 or 20 degrees to port.
Or you couldn't make a mistake.
The only other alternative is a set or leeway.
Couldn't possibly be. There wasn't enough wind to give us leeway.
It was a dead
We
calm.
were making a good course, steady course, everything was going along smoothly inside the factory. All I was afraid of was ice. And that's why I was on the bridge. Told the chief officer I would stay there until he came back, or until daylight.
And the third possibility, or rather the third check on your navigation, is the fact that you stopped in a position which by dead reckoning you estimated to be a certain one which you sent out by radio. In the morning, again by radio, you received the Titanic's estimated position where she said.
Yes.
You set off from your dead reckoning position to navigate to this other position, which we know was in effect marked by the Mount Temple. And you reached it. So, as a navigator, it seems to me that if you set off from one place to get to another, and you reach it, your first place must have been where you thought it was.
Yes. And you couldn't make a straight course to her position because of the ice.
You did your best to do a south 90
We went
west.
through this ice, narrow ice field there to the Mount Temple, thinking she might be the coffee. Found she wasn't. We saw this other ship on the port, back on the same side we'd been on, and we steamed back through the ice. That's when Ross was all coming along. Although we'd seen these other two ships at daybreak. Didn't see the Californian until 20 minutes past 8 in the morning. Right down.
No, I was thinking we'd get a very good recording of your clock. I'd forgotten this was working. Let's sum up again then. First of all, the Titanic's higher crow's nest means she should have seen you before you saw her. But according to the Times, she never did.
No.
So you couldn't have been the ship which came into her visual range. Secondly, the ship which made her fire rockets at 12:30 was moving. She came in from over the horizon and moved away again. And you were stopped and could have proved you were stopped all night.
Yes.
Thirdly, your navigation from where the icebergs, the three icebergs, were sighted, whose positions you sent out by wireless, and the Parisians sent out by wireless, long before there was any thought of you having to have an alibi, would mean that you'd have to make an unprecedented course 10 or 20 degrees to port. And it wasn't your practice to make a landfall 10 to 20 degrees.
It was ridiculous. We were making our course that I laid down at noon. No alteration was made. Maybe a degree of the alteration of variation or something. But the course laid down at noon by compass was steered.
In all your experience as a shipmaster, your landfalls were normally good?
Always. Always.
And you got to Boston, all right, after
No
this?
bother. Picked up Boston pilot and both went in.
So on that voyage, you've every reason to believe your navigation was impeccable.
Correct. Quite correct. Coming home, we arrived in Liverpool without any bother, without any zigzagging or anything.
Lord Mersey would have us believe that in the middle of this voyage, something went very wrong with the Californian